Okay everybody, so this is just a very simple split pea and ham soup. I have this ham bone that was in my freezer. It's actually a pretty good piece of ham, so I'll chunk off a piece of that probably. But you don't need to have a ton of ham. You could have just a little hock that you can buy in the grocery store. I think they're a couple of bucks. And those are nice because they're extra smoked, so I like those. If you have an end from a holiday meal, from a Thanksgiving, Christmas, or New Year's, you can certainly just hang on to the bone, throw it in the freezer, and when you want a pea soup, you just grab it out and let it thaw. I'm going to cut my onion here. This one was starting to sprout, so I wanted to make sure I used it before it went bad. I cut it in half, and then I peel the extra skin off. Okay, and I compost at my house, but if you don't, that's fine too. Composting is nice because it's good for your garden if you have one. Even if you have just a planter, it's nice to compost in the summer. So I always start and get my mise en place together. Mise en place is just everything you needed to make your soup. So here I have my onion. I'm going to cut it crossways. Oops. And then I'm going to cut it down. This is just a regular dice. Then I'll cut it across one more time. And make sure your knives are sharp, right? Sharp knives are much safer than dull, because if you have a dull knife, you're likely to slip. I'm going to also just go ahead here, once, twice across, and then a few times down. And then again, I'll turn the onion, and I'll slice it down this way. Got a little scrap over here. I'll cut that up because you can't have wastage, right? So then I'm going to gather this and I'll put it in a dish and set it aside. I've got 2 medium carrots here. I've got 2 stalks of celery. And I'm going to trim off. I've got a little section here I don't like. I'm going to trim that off, throw that in the compost. And that's the end. And I don't like my leaves in there because that makes my soup bitter. So I'll take care of those, take off the ends here. So for my celery, I'm just going to do, again, a small dice. I want to make sure my veggies are relatively the same size. You don't have to be exact, but it's nice to have them kind of close to the same size so they cook more evenly. And then I've just got my stalks of celery. I'm going to put my hands right up close to my knife blade, right? And I'm just going to slice with a nice even chop. And as I'm working, my hand is working backward. And keep your fingers curled under. And again, a sharp knife is better than a dull knife. So there's my celery. I'm going to set that aside. That's going to go in the pot next. My carrots, here again, trim off the ends. And these, if they're really thick carrots, I'll go ahead and I'll cut them in half this way, right, lengthways. But these are really nice and small, so I'm actually just going to leave them as rounds. Cut them down to size a little bit so they're easier to manage, and go ahead and, again, with my fingers curled under, I want to get relatively the same size so that my soup cooks evenly. So the classic blend of celery, onions, and carrots is called a mirepoix. It's a French word, mirepoix, and it's just the base for most soups. So if I'm cutting a mirepoix, I might cut a mirepoix for 2 or 3 different soups and just have it in the kitchen, store it in the refrigerator. So if I want to make 3 or 4 different soups in a week, I don't have to trim everything, I don't have to wash everything. It's already all done. I do it once for many times during the week, and you can even cook it and freeze it, I suppose, if you wanted to. But it's really, this is the base for most soups, right? This is a little bit of garlic here. I'm going to go ahead and, let me just clean my blade. I'm going to go ahead and cut up my garlic. And again, I like to just give it a good smash. Peel this off, compost that. Take that off, compost that. And then you can use a garlic press, or you can just chop it up roughly. It really, what you don't want to do is smash it too much, because then you lose all your flavor onto the cutting board. So I like to either press it right into my soup or just give it a quick little rough chop here. And that is the basis of the pea soup. Literally, once you have this part, this is the part that takes the longest. Once you have this part done, the rest of it's easy. It's just putting it together and letting it cook. So that took me all of about 10 minutes. And the soup that I'm going to make is going to last for a couple of days anyway. So, you know, that's several meals worth. Got a couple of bay leaves, right? Bay leaves they add a nice flavor. They're not required. If you don't have them, just don't put them in. That's not a problem. And then I've got some fresh dried thyme here. I have a garden out back, so I dry my own herbs. But if you don't have a garden, you can just buy thyme at the grocery store. If you don't have thyme, you can use any seasoning, really. Basil is nice. You could even use parsley. Straight up parsley is nice. So any combination of herbs that you like is perfectly fine. So that's that. I'm going to move everybody over to the stovetop and we'll take a look at what it looks like then. Okay, so here is that ham bone. I cut it down, like I said, so it was just the bone, or, well, it's got a big chunk of meat on it. Put just a tiny bit of olive oil in. And again, if you don't have olive oil, use peanut oil. Use whatever oil you have. I'm just going to spread my oil there a little bit. With the meat that's left over, I can make a ham salad. I can put it into omelets. I could add it into, I could just slice it and use it for ham. I could put it into another soup dish, a pork and beans. You know, there's an endless list of things you can do with leftover ham. As most people, you know, they run out of ideas before they run out of ham. So it's a really good, when you can buy it on sale, it's a great economical piece of meat. And it gives and gives. So I just let that warm up a little bit. It doesn't really need to be browned at all. I just like to let some of the fat render off. Give it a turn or two. And again, I'm on a little bit of a high flame here. I'm going to turn it down to medium. And then as soon as that starts to release its fat a little bit, I'll go ahead in with the onions first. And the reason I go in with the onions first is they're going to take a little bit longer to cook. Same thing with the carrots. They can go right in on top. And what you're going to do next is let those sweat. That is, you want to cook them until they're a little bit translucent. So I give them a good mix so they're coated with oil. And I put just the tiniest bit of salt on just the vegetables. Remember, there's a lot of salt in ham. So you don't want to over-season. Remember that the longer you cook out your vegetables, the more flavor you're going to get. And that's one of the reasons why we like to cook things at a nice low and slow temperature, and we put things in at different stages. So, you just pull out my vegetables here a little bit. You can see too that there's a little bit of juice developing. That's the ham starting to render its own juices. These onions are very definitely becoming translucent. The carrots have a little bit longer to go. You'll see them, they'll get a visible softness to them. You're not going to cook them all the way, obviously, but you are going to just cook them until they're a little bit softer for this in this sweating stage. Because my carrots are almost there, I'm going to go ahead and add my celery now. And again, I put that in last because celery has more water than everything else. So as I'm adding in my vegetables, I want the other vegetables to have a chance to develop some flavor. The celery is going to water out, and it's going to give its flavor to the rest of the batch. So I'll add in my celery. Again, let that sweat for a little bit. Put just a tiny pinch of salt, and at this point I'll put in some black pepper. If you don't have a grinder, that's fine. Use whatever you've got. Just try to use seasonings that are at least reasonably fresh. So within 6 months or so, after 6 months, they start losing their flavor. So we'll let that steam for a little, or sweat for a little bit. And again, keeping the lid on also helps to keep the flavor in, because when you can see the vapors coming up off the top of the lid out of this, so all of that is flavorful, flavor oils essentially coming up out of the soup. So you lose a lot of flavor if your lid is off constantly. So that celery and onion and carrot and the ham bone have been cooking for about 10 minutes perhaps. There's a really nice aroma coming off. I wish you could smell it. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and add in that garlic, right? That was the 3 cloves of garlic, 2 large, 3 small. I'll add that in. At this point too, in the pan itself, you'll notice that the bottom of the pan is starting to have a little bit of stickage. It's starting to look a little thick and sticky on the bottom. That's actually really good, because that means that you're starting to draw out the natural sugars of the vegetables, and they're starting to really share their flavor with the dish. The ham itself is beginning to release its flavor as well, and we've got some nice translucency in the onions, and you can see the carrots and celery are starting to break down as well. So now, this is the fun part. We'll go ahead and add our peas. I took these peas, I had a giant bag, so I took about a pound of the bag. The minute I opened them, I could smell that these were delicious peas. They were right from the food shelf, and they're delicious. So I gave them a good rinse under the sink, under the water, and then if I really was concerned, I could spread them out onto a sheet tray and sort through, making sure there were no stones or little pieces of mud. These look really good, so I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to go ahead and dump those in after they've had their bath. And now at this point too, I'll add, remember I had a bay leaf and some fresh thyme. I'm going to go ahead and add that bay leaf in, and then I'm going to go ahead and rub the thyme in between my hands. That helps to open up the oils in the dried thyme as well. I'll sprinkle that about. Give everything a really good stir. I can't wait to have this for dinner. And it doesn't take that long to cook. You can cook the pea soup in about an hour, maybe an hour and a half if you really want it to mush out. And now that I've got everything in there, go ahead and add some water. And I'll go give that a stir so there's nothing sticking. If there's anything sticking now, it's for sure going to stick later. So you want to make sure you don't have any stick. Just go on underneath and pull up that nice, you can already see the color. This is just gorgeous. If you have chicken stock, right, you can use chicken stock. If you happen to have pork stock, you could use pork stock. Vegetable stock is lovely as well, but I just use straight up water. And because I have so many aromatic vegetables in there already, it takes on the flavor of those vegetables. And then of course the ham and the peas and the herbs and the garlic. And the nice thing here is that I really don't measure anything, and I don't recommend you do either. Just go ahead and let the spirit move you. Cooking isn't a science, especially when it comes to soups. You can adjust them as you go. If it's too thin, you can add a little instant mashed potato to thicken it up. If it's too thick, you can add some more stock to water it down again, or some more water to water it down again. Basically, at this point now, she's ready to simmer, and as soon as it comes up to a simmer, I'll just keep cooking it until the peas are mushable, and then ladle it up and serve it with a nice piece of good hearty bread and butter. That's my recommendation. So there you have it. Let me put the cover on. I'm going to turn down my heat to low at this point, medium low, and I'll let that come up slowly and finish cooking. So you can see now that this has been cooking for about 20 minutes, and I just wanted to show you the stage of the peas here. You can see they're starting to swell up, they're starting to open a little bit, but they're still super hard. When you pinch them, they're really hard. You can't even really, you can cut them with your fingernail, right? But they're definitely still hard. So we've got probably another, I would say probably another hour on this soup to go. We'll just let it cook. By that time too, the ham will be falling off the bone, and we'll know that we're done. The nice thing about cooking with a bone itself is it'll give your soup an extra richness. There's a lot of collagen in a bone, so that collagen is a protein that breaks down while you're cooking, and that's where you get that really rich, thick soup. So we'll leave that alone. I'm going to put the cover back on. It's on a very, very low flame, and oftentimes, even on my tiniest flame, it will still start to scorch as it gets thick. So I'll put a trivet underneath it. A trivet is just a piece of metal that puts a little air barrier between your flame and your pot, and that trivet will keep it from burning. But definitely recommend it with thicker soups. At least you want to give it a stir every every 15 or 20 minutes probably. So this has been cooking a little more than an hour. You can see that the peas are really starting to mush down, and in actual fact the ham is coming off the bone as well. You can see that bone is cleaning up really nicely. I'm going to keep letting this simmer so gently, and I'm going to leave the cover off a little bit because I want to lose some of that liquid at this point. It's so close to being done now though. Honestly, if just a pro tip, if you soak your peas overnight, you can cook it in about 2/3 the time, so it slashes your time. If you're not in a rush and you want to just cook it slow over the stove for a couple of hours, you can do that too. This is a very forgiving soup. You can cook it as long as you need to. You can speed things up if you have to, if you're in a bit of a rush. Another thing people are doing nowadays is using the Instapot if you have one. I personally love to cook soups right on the stovetop because I love the smell. You can see the very, very gentle bubbles that are coming up. That's a really perfect simmer. Just slow and slow to draw out all the flavors. We'll give this probably another 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll put it through a blender and then on to the table and into our bellies. It's getting really close now. That's going to be a delicious dinner. One thing I always recommend people do is taste as they're cooking, right? So you taste, season, and adjust. And honestly, because of the salt that's in the ham, don't want to add any more salt to that. The only thing I'm going to do is add a little bit of black pepper and let it cook for another 5 or 10 minutes. Good. That was probably a half a teaspoon maybe of black pepper. You can add more or less according to your taste. That's just a beautiful thing there. Look at how that's fallen right off the bone. Ah, doesn't get any better than that, my friends. So this is our final product. I've taken out the ham bone. It's sitting over here. I've taken out the bay leaves because I hate it when I grind my bay leaves in my blender. Right, and the soup is still looking a little thin. Right, if I wanted to, I could just cook it down a little bit more. I'm going to go ahead and blend it and see where we are. And I'll take you over to the blender here in a second. So this is one of those things where I make a mess if I'm not really paying attention. So I'll do a couple of ladles just to show you what I'm doing. And then I'll focus on what I'm doing so that I don't make a mess of my kitchen. Basically, I ladle it into the blender. Any blender will do. This happens to be a pretty industrial one, but even a regular bar blender will be fine. I like to blend my soups because it gives it a finer texture. If you don't have a blender, you could use a food mill. If you don't have a food mill, they have immersion blenders. They look like sticks, and any kind of a blender will do. And at the end of the day, if you don't have a blender, don't blend it. It'll still taste delicious. So let me go ahead and blend this up, and I'll show you the finished product. Of course, you want to be super careful when you're blending to be on slow speed. And start slow. You can always move it faster. Okay, so here's my finished soup. I've pureed it. It's nice and rich and thick. It's got good color. It smells delicious. And then a little further back on my cutting board, here's my bone. And I took my bone out of the soup, and I didn't clean it off completely yet, but you can see the most of the meat was falling off the bone. And then over here, I chunked up a lot of it. And so I'll put those chunks into the soup bowl. Into the soup itself, and then it's ready to serve. So let me go ahead and put that together for you. And the nice thing about pea soup is with a little hunk of bread, or big hunk of bread and some butter, it makes a full meal. It's healthy, it's packed with vegetables, good B vitamins in the peas themselves. They've got a lot of trace minerals in the peas themselves. So a delicious, rich, wholesome family dinner. You can serve this for lunch, you can serve it for dinner. It's good for family and friends.